begin. My name is Nimrod Goren. I'm head of Mitvim, which is a foreign policy think tank working on Israel-regional relations. I'm joined here with Gabriel Mitchell and former Ambassador Harari. And we'll be doing a briefing over the next hour about the prospects of negotiations between Israel and Lebanon on maritime borders. Over the last few weeks, there has been some positive news about some breakthroughs in the process towards negotiations with American mediation. Just today, you may have seen some reports that this process is not going as easy as people expected, and there are some additional hurdles on the way. Of course, nothing comes very easy in this neighborhood. But that development happens after a long period of time in which Israel and Lebanon did not sit around the same table and negotiated. It happens after quite significant American mediation that didn't begin recently. It also goes back to the Obama administration with different efforts. And it happens within the context of changing geopolitical dynamics within the broader Eastern Mediterranean region, where we see an Eastern Mediterranean gas forum established in Cairo, and we see alliances between Greece and Cyprus and Israel and other countries, where we see tensions between Turkey and Cyprus on drilling rights. So there is a broader context to what we'll be speaking about here today. We'll be having a short conversation among us to launch, to kick off the debate, and then we will open up to your questions and your remarks. On my left is Gabriel Mitchell. Gabi is a policy fellow at the Mitvim Institute. His research focuses on the nexus between energy and foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically as it relates to Israel's engagement with its regional neighbors. Between 2016 to 2018, Gabi served as Mitvim's representative in Washington, D.C. In addition, he also held fellowship position at the Hudson Institute and at the Shalem Center, and he works as the Associate Director of Kivunim, a study abroad program for overseas students here in Israel. Ambassador Harari, who held senior position in Israeli Foreign Ministry, was in the research division and deputy head of the Policy Planning Bureau. He served as Israel's ambassador to Cyprus until 2015. He currently teaches political science and energy at the Israel-Lebanon College up north, and is a policy fellow at Mitvim and consult different entities on regional issues. Into business. The first question I will ask you, Gabi, we often hear about Israel and Lebanon in relation to Hezbollah and that type of conflicts, but now we are talking about a different dispute on maritime border. So what is this dispute all about, and why is it important for both countries to try and find a solution to it?
Okay, thank you. First, thanks for coming, especially those of you who came and did some walking in this heat. As you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from the United States, so I'll start with just an early, if there are Americans here, a happy 4th of July. The dispute between Israel and Lebanon over its maritime border is really an extension of disputes that exist between the two countries regarding their territorial borders. Essentially, the way that it traditionally works is that maritime borders are determined and defined by where territorial borders meet the sea. And depending on the Israeli perspective versus the Lebanese perspective, you'll get different opinions as to where that border should actually exist. So there's a disputed space of some 860 square kilometers in which, depending on your perspective, from the Israeli perspective, that line is drawn from a 90-degree angle from the shoreline, and from the Lebanese perspective, it's from a 0-degree angle, a flat angle from the shoreline. So depending on your perspective, will frame whether you think some of these territorial waters should be on the Israeli side versus the Lebanese side. But obviously, with all things Israel-Lebanon, the maritime dispute is an extension of existing disputes between the two countries that have been in existence and continued since 1948 and were further exacerbated in the 70s and 80s, right? We are all aware of the fact that Hezbollah is a primary actor in Lebanon, and since Israel started to develop and explore its own territorial waters in the pursuit of offshore natural gas, Hezbollah has made it very clear at times that it has plans or intentions, or has at least threatened to target those pieces of infrastructure, in particular offshore platforms. So from an Israeli perspective, there is a security angle a desire to resolve this dispute over this territory. And certainly from the Lebanese perspective, and even from Hezbollah's perspective, there is indeed an interest to perhaps resolve this issue. Maybe not today, as there was some news that maybe the talks won't be going on as planned. But from the Lebanese perspective, just like Israel or Cyprus or Egypt, where international companies have come in to explore the waters and develop them, Lebanon also hopes that there will be offshore natural gas and, as a result, an economic windfall. Lebanon is in deep economic crisis, and as a result, Hezbollah itself is also in a serious economic situation. On top of that, there are US sanctions that are in the process of being levied upon Hezbollah and obviously upon Iran. So there are a number of incentives in place on the Lebanese side as well to deal with this issue so that international companies who might be interested in exploring the waters don't end up having to ask too many questions about where's the line, who does this water belong to, and obviously, more importantly, whatever potential resources are underneath it.
Thank you. Mickey, it's not the first time that different international mediators are trying to resolve this conflict. What were the main attempts in the past and why have they been failing? And what is the reason do you think that this time around things at least seem to be more successful than before?
Thanks very much. You're right, of course. In the past, there were a few efforts in order to resolve these disputes, mainly by American mediation. It was 2011, 2012. And they were quite intensive, I would say, let's say, consultations between all sides. It ended then with some kind of informal compromise, let's say, by the Americans. Reports then in the past basically indicated that Israel did accept this informal compromise, the Lebanese did not react. What happened nowadays that we are witnessing and we are basically, let's say, waiting to see whether this negotiation will be resumed. I think two main factors are very much important to understand, mainly on the Lebanese side. A, the economy, as Gabriel mentioned. The economy in Lebanon is not doing well, to put it in an understatement, basically. It's doing very bad. And two, which is very much important as well, is the regional cooperation developments in the region are going very well, and Lebanon is watching it. And basically it sees that Israel and Cyprus and Greece and Israel and Egypt, and not to mention, of course, the Regional Gas Forum in Cairo, which was initiated last January. So these developments emphasize to Lebanon that if it wants to, let's say, to take advantage of its energy potential, it should resolve somehow this dispute with Israel. From the Israeli point of view, of course, as Gabi said, I mean, this is a source of instability. It's better to resolve it than to leave it this way. But I suppose, I mean, we have to understand very much the Lebanese angle here, which is in a way much more interesting. And the difficulties that, right, let's say this morning, were most probably the resumption of this negotiation will be delayed. This is part of the process. I mean, it's not an easy process, of course, especially between players like Lebanon and Israel.
Yes, and the difficulties that were reported today related to who will mediate, and the Israeli demanded the U.S. would be the main mediator versus the Lebanese request that the UN will be mediating as well, plus the question of whether it will be limited only to the maritime border or will have any relevance to the land border, and whether it will be open-ended negotiations or ones that are shorter in time. Gabi, because these negotiations cannot take place bilaterally, there are international actors involved. When we hear about the US, we heard now about the UN, Cyprus also voiced interest in mediating. Who are the main actors in the international arena looking at that? What are their motivations? And how do you envision, should such negotiations begin, how do you envision it taking place also vis-a-vis internal opposition in Lebanon by Hezbollah?
Sure. I think that you identified the primary actors on the international stage. The United States and the UN seem to be playing the primary roles of trying to fill that space of mediator or facilitator, depending on which language is most appropriate for each side. Obviously, other regional actors are looking at these negotiations with a tremendous amount of interest. You've mentioned the gas forum and the potential for regional cooperation, at least in the field of energy, on a multilateral level. I would say in addition to that, there are other outstanding maritime territorial disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean between Cyprus and Turkey, for the sake of example, and perhaps some of the interest in what goes on between Israel and Lebanon is to understand maybe, or to find the mechanisms for resolving other disputes. But the bottom line is, outside of the United States and the United Nations, there are two other actors that are important to bring into the picture. The first is the European Union, which is in the process of identifying the feasibility of perhaps some kind of undersea gas pipeline option from the Eastern Mediterranean to Europe, and obviously is curious about where Lebanon fits within that picture. European countries and European companies have shown interest in exploring in Lebanon's waters, so there is a European angle here, but most importantly, there's also an Iranian voice, which is present or not present. It's making its influence perhaps through Hezbollah and through Hezbollah's allies within the Lebanese parliament, but it would be naive to assume that while one set of diplomatic processes are taking place on one side of the region between the United States and Iran, indirectly of course, that they are not in some way influencing or have some kind of ramifications for the processes that are taking place here. In terms of expectations, the United States has had a tremendous amount of interest in resolving this dispute. It started in the Obama administration, and negotiations failed in 2012. Those processes were essentially picked up by the Trump administration, which I think had a slightly different approach than the Obama administration, and basically set forth the following agenda. If the parties in the region are interested in negotiating, we'll be happy to facilitate, but we're not going to push any of the parties together. And so there has been Lebanese and Hezbollah interest in resolving this issue. I very much think that today's news is a part of the negotiation process, as Mickey identified. But the primary facilitator of those conversations, the Assistant Secretary of State, David Satterfield, has been nominated to become the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. So even this small delay could result in a much longer delay if he does inevitably get appointed, and his successor will require more time to reevaluate the situation, develop relationships with all the acting parties. So there are a number of floating pieces here, all of which could create further and further delays, but I don't think any of those delays would create enough reason for the Lebanese to not continue to show interest in this negotiation process. And as Mickey identified, I think that the Lebanese side is much more interesting than the Israeli side. Israel provided or proposed a 55-45 split in 2012. It was rejected by Lebanon, but I don't see Israel offering anything better than that in subsequent negotiations. So it's just a question of, where's the leverage, where are the interests? Yeah.
Of course, when you talk about Israeli position, it's a question of who within the Israeli government is leading these negotiations, and the people in the foreign ministry. We know that this is not always the body that leads such negotiations, although it's a typical or natural actor to do so. Assuming there will be these talks going on, and assuming there will be reaching some agreement on maritime border, do you see any prospects for a positive momentum emerging that will spill over for progress on other issues, contested issues between Israel and Lebanon, or will it begin end-to-end on maritime issues?
I think that in order to achieve progress on the maritime issue, it is better to make a distinction between this one and all the rest. Otherwise, it will complicate the negotiation. We should bear in mind that the Lebanese interest is very much, let's say, Lebanese economy and energy one. It's not an interest, let's say, to resolve all the issues which are very much, let's say, these days between Lebanon and Israel. And the most pressing issue is the maritime border. So I would assume that if and when negotiations will start again, if it will lead to a success, let's say, bottom line. Success bottom line, I suppose, should be very much informal. We shouldn't expect something like a formal celebration or whatever. It's not at all. But informal agreement on that, I think, which is still quite far away, just to put things in perspective, it will be, I suppose, only concerning the maritime issue.
Okay. And as a final question before we open up, both of you related to issues that are happening in the East Med, or the gas forum and Turkey and Cyprus. So can you look at the Israel-Lebanese issue in the broader context of Eastern Mediterranean relations? And we need to remember that East Med also includes Gaza, the issue of Gaza Marine. So how does also the Palestinian issue, if at all, relate to that topic? So what's the bigger context, the bigger regional context?
I think that the bigger regional context is that you have at least the building blocks of some kind of regional cooperation in the form of the East Med Gas Forum. That includes parties like Egypt and Greece and Cyprus and Israel. It includes representation from Jordan, the Palestinians. It includes Italy as well. But there's no guarantee that that forum is really going to be able to grow and succeed over the long term for a variety of different factors, and not solely because of the interest of all the parties. It seems like all the parties have genuine interest in making sure that this forum succeeds in some way, shape, or form. But we have to recognize that there are other developments that are taking place far beyond the region. First is just the global energy market, and the decline in prices for natural gas may limit the capacity of all of these regional actors to not only create a mechanism to export gas to some other location, but also for them to effectively cooperate with one another. It might end up that most of the parties decide to just work either independently or find other parties, right, or other mechanisms for exporting gas. So there's that to take into consideration. I think it's important to take into consideration the degree to which outside actors like the European Union, like the United States, even in some certain contexts, Russia, decide to involve themselves in regional affairs. I think that there's a very constructive way in which some of these actors can play a role, but there are still serious disputes between Cyprus and Turkey, between Israel and Lebanon, and Israel and the Palestinians, although I would say that is really the third of these three disputes that would need to be worked out over the course of time for that process to realize its full potential. We don't know whether there are other gas fields out there in the Mediterranean that need to be explored. This is a lot of this work and a lot of this diplomatic activity is based on projections and not only the existing fields, but it should be given a chance. That's the bottom line. It should be given a chance.
Just briefly, I think the last 7, 8, 10 years, we are witnessing actually quite an impressive development in the East Med. I mean, look at it from what was happening in the last few years. I mean, we are witnessing a triangle between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. We are witnessing a triangle between Cyprus, Greece, and Egypt. And there is a bit of, let's say, geometry starting to play a role in these international relations, which means that in the last 10 years, the East Med region has brought, let's say, upon a possible cooperation, and part of it basically is substantial cooperation between some players, partly because of energy, partly because of the other developments in the region, post-Arab Spring, etc. But these impressive development, or let's put it this way, the Lebanese angle should be seen as part of these developments in the region. Otherwise, we will miss, I suppose, a very crucial point vis-a-vis our topic today.
Yeah, so the attempt is for more inclusive mechanisms in the region?
Very much. If I'm not mistaken, last April, the ministers of foreign affairs and energy of Cyprus and Lebanon met in Beirut. The Lebanese side emphasized its will to establish, let's say, a triangle with Cyprus and Greece. So in a way, there is a kind of competition, so-called, let's say, for some players in the region that have to take part in different kind of, let's say, groups, which, in my opinion, this is quite positive development for the region and for each player. And of course, from the Israeli point of view, but Put aside Israel, this is quite impressive and positive development. Where it will lead, nobody knows, because there are quite a lot of, let's say, still obstacles, but look at it from this point of view as well, which is quite interesting.
And there is an attempt by Cyprus to try to bring all these triangles together in one secretariat. And for the Israeli foreign policy, the Eastern Mediterranean is becoming a more significant issue, partly because it enables Israel to practice win-win diplomacy, to be in relation with countries that are at odds with each other, to have ties with Turkey, with Greece, with Cyprus, with Egypt, even with the Palestinians. So for the Israeli foreign policy, which used to be kind of in regional isolation mode, this is a new component.
Absolutely.
We are very much
Absolutely. Just to emphasize, with your permission, at this point, any triangle or whatever group that takes place in the region, this is a positive development from the Israeli point of view. Even groups which Israel is not part of it. Especially, of course, if it is, let's say, like the regional forum, gas forum in Cairo.
Thank you. We're opening up the debate for your questions. So when you ask your question, please say who you are. If you want to address the question to a specific speaker, please do so. And try to keep it short and focused so we have enough time to take as many questions as we can. So please, the floor is yours.
What is the
Say your name.
size, what is the size of the disputed area? And do you have an idea of how much gas is believed to be in there?
So the space is somewhere around 860 square kilometers. In terms of projected gas, there has been very little attempted exploration in that space because of the existing issues, so it's very difficult to say. From the Lebanese perspective, one of Israel's fields somewhat encroaches on that space, but once again, that's not a position that Israel agrees with. So it's difficult to say. We don't know. There certainly is a cluster of natural gas fields that exist in the nexus of where Israel, Egypt, and Cyprus's maritime boundaries meet, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything for further exploration or further developments. But from a Lebanese perspective, there's an assumption that if they manage to strike gold multiple times in the area, that they would be just as successful in Lebanon's waters. There's a certain logic to that, and they would to its fullest potential because of the serious economic issues that are going on in Lebanon right now. Yeah.
My name is Jason Galliani. Did the Obama administration put forward any bridging proposal during the talks in 2012?
It did, actually, yes, of course, yes. I mean, it did, and as I said before, there was a compromise, let's say, offered by the Americans. Most probably Israel did accept it, and the Lebanese did not reply. So I suppose the negotiation, when it will start in a way based on this compromise, although this is an informal.
There is a difference between the Obama and Trump administration towards these issues?
I don't think so.
I think it only depends on perspective. I think potentially from the Lebanese perspective, there's a concern that the Trump administration is more willing to give Israel a blank check when it comes to defining its own borders and its boundaries. We see some examples of that regarding both Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. So perhaps there's also an incentive on the Lebanese side to be proactive, to engage in dialogue, even if it's in some way facilitated by the United States, under the, perhaps the concern that Israel will unilaterally declare those waters belonging to itself. So, I'm not necessarily certain that those are legitimate fears, but I do think that those fears or those concerns do exist, given developments over the last couple of years. Yeah.
Is Lebanon looking for foreign capital? Are they able themselves to finance erecting gas fields, or would they need maybe uranium batteries?
So they need, like many of the regional actors, they need foreign companies with the expertise and the technology to come in to both explore and then develop that natural gas. So for the sake of example, the Italian company Eni has demonstrated interest in exploring in Lebanon's waters, as has a Russian company, I'm trying to remember, perhaps Novatek?
Novatek.
Yeah, Novatek.
And Total.
And Total, which is obviously an oil and gas giant, major. So there is interest, but the Lebanese don't have the technology and the know-how to do it themselves, and I'd be very surprised if the Iranians were to engage in that way. That would be perceived differently.
I think this is a very important point, if I may. Basically, governments do not invest money in order to drill for gas or whatever. This is investment which is done by international companies. Now, in order for international companies to come and invest a lot of money, they need to have, as much as possible, stable circumstances. Stable circumstances meaning that for Lebanon, it needs to solve this dispute with Israel. This is what behind that. I mean, in a way, you can look at it from beyond the 2 points that we mentioned. Let's say that the economy in Lebanon is not doing very well, and the regional cooperation is going very well as well. I suppose the international companies, the relevant international companies, are pressuring the Lebanese government as well to stabilize circumstances, stabilize the situation as much as possible. Otherwise, why should I spend or invest so much money?
Especially if we're talking about companies that already have investments in the region, like Eni and Total, who envision perhaps some kind of pooling of resources in order to maximize profit. So that's an important consideration.
I have a question. Alisa from Bloomberg News. I read that Israel wants to limit negotiations to 6 months and the Lebanese want to leave it open. What are the motivations on both sides for those positions?
Well, I suppose, I mean, those details are interesting but not very much crucial. This is part of the, I would say, the poker game or negotiation, let's say, process. It doesn't make sense to limit it for 6 months. It does make sense to reach an agreement as soon as possible. So, I don't know, I mean, this is, in my opinion, not a key point. The key point, other key point, which if it is, let's say, an obstacle, is whether this negotiation should focus only on the maritime border or it should include as well the rest of the issues. I suppose that, okay, if I think about it rationally as much as possible, okay, states are players and not always they do think pure rationally, but if both sides would like to solve this issue because it is pressuring, as we just now said, so it makes much more sense to focus on the maritime border only in order to reach, yes or no, a possible, let's say, solution. It doesn't make sense to complicate it with other issues as well. So if there is a Lebanese condition, which I suppose is part of it, to include other issues, I would assume that this is part of the negotiation process. Otherwise,
And it probably reflects the opposition by groups within
That's right,
Lebanon to
yes,
that process.
yes.
The question is whether we see Lebanon doing a U-turn and backing for previous understanding because of pressure either for Hezbollah or for others, or it's more for negotiation backing to improve.
my feeling these days, today I would say, is that this is a part of the negotiation process. Because it doesn't make sense for Lebanon to agree to go for this negotiation without prior approval, let's say, by players like Hezbollah in Lebanon. Which means that there was in Lebanon this kind of a process which all the relevant players domestically did agree to resume negotiation. Now, in order to keep this agreement for the negotiation, for the sake of the negotiation, you have to, let's say, to gain some profit, I would say. And you have to make sure that all the relevant parties are with you during this negotiation. So I suppose we will witness this kind of obstacles through the whole process of negotiation when it will start.
Hi, I'm Eliana from Jewish News Syndicate. Recently, last week, there was the Bahrain Summit, the workshop. I was wondering, because that had to do with economic development and cooperation, do we know if anything discussed there had to do with maritime cooperation and economic development based on that?
No, not that I'm aware of. I think that it's important to separate those two processes, that the processes that Israel and other actors in the Eastern Mediterranean are engaged in are Eastern Mediterranean focused, and of the Eastern Mediterranean states, only, or the Eastern Mediterranean actors, 4 of them are Arab, but 2 of them are European, and Israel is kind of in its own category. So I think that these processes are separate. That being said, we are experiencing an environment in which actors in the region are more willing to consider economic initiatives with Israel than they were previous to that. And I think that it's worth noting that Israel's negotiations with Lebanon are taking place within this period of time as well. Lebanon being a country that still harbors, I would say, more and a greater degree of public and institutional hostility towards Israel in comparison, say, to the Gulf states, right? So all of this is taking place in a window of time in which economic interests are perhaps superseding, not political interests, but perhaps identity politics.
I would say a word on that because I think Lebanon was one of the only Arab countries that went out very negatively against the Trump plan, that they refused to engage in any manner. And I was quite proud of that, so Lebanese speakers emphasized that. So when you go back to your remark, Gabi, about how Trump's relation with Israel is perceived in that context, that may be an issue. And the other point is about Gaza Marine. You asked about the connection between the East Med and the Palestinian issue. The limitation of the economic plans that do not have any political backing is we can talk about developing the Gaza Marine field, but if it's not clear who is doing that and whether the West Bank and Gaza is under a unified leadership, all those economic visions are not practically to implement politically.
So what's the prognosis for resumption of talks?
Can you repeat the question?
What is the prognosis
For
for
the
the
resumption of
in
talks?
terms of when will it happen?
Because
would
it
be
has
very
broken down.
Report.
I will be very disappointed if it will not resume. Again, I will be quite disappointed if it will not resume quite soon. Not because of me personally, but I think it does make sense for both sides, and as we emphasized, maybe a little bit more the Lebanese side to have this kind of negotiation. But it's typical, I would say, obstacles.
There are some actors pushing for it. Who are they?
Pushing for the delay?
Pushing for resolution.
I think pushing for the negotiation, this is both sides. It's Lebanon and Israel. And United States, it is the best mediator in a way. Correct? Forgive me for emphasizing this. It is the only mediator which can deliver, if at all, an outcome. So I suppose, the main players who do push very much for having this negotiation is Lebanon and Israel. And the developments in the region and the prospects for energy. Look, Israel went ahead with this potential. Egypt is going ahead with this potential. Greece and Cyprus and Europe, where we speak about the East Med project, whether it will take place or not doesn't matter, but it goes ahead. So if anyone wants to join this trend, it should be part of this development. It should solve an angle which is quite important, let's say, in order to go ahead.
So the important point is that the motivation is local.
The motivation is local.
Not a
That's
mediator
right.
who tries to push, but there are friends that have the
It's
willingness,
not-
and the mediator is just helping them.
This is a very, very good question because in a way, we try to identify the external players who have an interest. In this episode, I think the players themselves are the more of interest.
If the same question was asked to Lebanese negotiators, what would be their answer about the quality of the mediator?
Well, as Gabi said, the Americans are very much not popular as a mediator.
You say it's the best mediator.
But you see, this is not a contest of popularity, it's a contest of who can deliver. And if there is anyone who can deliver, a big if, okay, it's only Washington. Now, clearly, from Lebanese point of view, Trump administration, this is a tricky one. It does enjoy too close, let's say, cooperation relations with Israel, but there is no one else. There are, of course, other external players who can influence, but if there is a player who may push ahead and maybe deliver, I suppose it is Washington. with or without enthusiasm.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment.
Following up for you guys, part of the Israeli opposition is to the UN involvement.
Yes.
But in recent years, we see the UN Special Envoy, Nimrod being very successful in preventing wars between Israel and Hamas. And Israel, maybe its image towards UN mediation is shifting. So it's only local perception towards Gaza, but it doesn't spill over on UN mediation regarding other issues?
I suppose UN mediation vis-a-vis Lebanon includes, in a way, almost by definition, the rest other issues that concerning Israel and Lebanon. And if you want to, or if both sides would like to concentrate on the maritime issue, it doesn't make sense to include the UN. Even, and you are very much right, that the UN perception in Israel, well, is more positive, to put it this way.
Oh.
Maybe the UN perception in Israel is more positive than the US perception in Lebanon. You do not negotiate eye level if you impose on your second party the negotiator or the mediator. And I really don't understand why Israel thinks that it can impose. If you want to conduct negotiations with us, the State of Israel, you have to accept the United States as the mediator.
No, Gabriel.
I think that the direction is a little bit different. First, and this was something that was already agreed upon, the United Nations has a role to play. It's just from the Israeli perspective, there's a desire for the United Nations not to be the primary mediator. The United Nations did offer to provide the framework, the physical space for those meetings to take place somewhere near the Lebanese-Israeli border. So the United Nations is involved, but I agree with Mickey that this is the desire is coming both from Israel and from Lebanon. I do think that there's more Lebanese interest than Israeli interest in achieving some kind of an agreement. And this is the negotiating strategy of many actors in the region, that you want it badly, but you also have to demonstrate a lack of desire to want the deal in order for the negotiation process to go the way that you want it. So I do think that this is a negotiation strategy, no more, no less, and that Washington, given its diplomatic relations with both countries and its interests in both, obviously, serving some kind of role of ensuring Israeli interests in the region, but more importantly, ensuring Lebanese stability, and that includes economic and political stability, that Washington is actually in a unique position to play the role of mediator, even if that means mediation with maybe some other voices in the room, including the United Nations. So I don't think that this is top-down Washington imposed upon Beirut and Jerusalem to engage in direct negotiations. For the last almost decade, it's been coming from both the Israeli side and the Lebanese side, a desire to resolve these issues for all the reasons that we mentioned beforehand. In particular, the desire to attract foreign investment into their respective territorial waters.
Ilse Strauss, what are the chances of success of the negotiations, and is there any expected time frame for that?
It's hard to tell. I mean, this is a very good question, actually. I mean, on the one hand, as we were saying, the interest of both sides are for reaching an agreement. On the other hand, the obstacles, relevant and non-relevant obstacles, are quite many. So I don't know which part wins. I think that it seems so that these days the interest of going ahead with enjoying the potential of energy is quite powerful. If it is so the chances should be a little bit more than that. If I may refer to the verb imposing, this is not imposing. I mean, basically, imposing the U.S. mediation. It's whether. I mean, the main question mark. I mean, it's if anyone wants to reach a deal, I suppose we should identify who is the best to contribute to a deal. And I think that from this perspective, the best mediation it's not perfect mediation. I mean, it's for the time being, it's Washington. You can look at it as well from different angles. If someone can deliver Israel, is Washington basically. So from an effective point of view, from practical point of view, this is the way that it should.
I think the question when you compare it to the American war in the Palestinian issue is whether Washington is doing fair play vis-a-vis
It
the
doesn't.
Lebanese.
It doesn't. So what? It doesn't. It doesn't. The main question should be who can contribute.
I would also add, and I think that this is important, this is not incredibly high up on the list of
Yes, yes.
American agendas,
Yes,
right?
yes.
It used to be that the U.S. Sixth Fleet was permanently located in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's been, at the very least for the time being, relocated because of where American interests in the region lie. There's one individual, David Satterfield, who is engaged in this process, and obviously I'm sure a host of assistants, but one man versus a naval fleet it demonstrates the kind of balance of interests here. There's more energy going into the Trump peace plan than the Trump administration's initiatives between Israel and Lebanon. So it's a part of, I think, an effort to essentially extend and continue existing foreign policy goals that preceded the Trump administration, that existed during the Obama administration, and I would argue during the Obama administration were even more committed and more significant than what's taking place under the Obama administration. But the United States remains one of the unique actors on the geopolitical stage that can, like Mickey said, bring Israel to a negotiating table, but also take into consideration the interests of other actors, in this case, the Lebanese.
Can Europe contribute? Do you see any European countries that have something to contribute? They are currently not present in that. But
Cyprus.
Cyprus
Greece.
can help negotiations.
I think that it is not a coincidence, basically, that the meeting that took place in Beirut, was very much, last April that I mentioned, the Lebanese were so much emphasizing their interest to go ahead and to join whatever clubs in the region. But again, there is a difference between assisting or supporting or facilitating and mediating. I think there is a difference here. And again, it's in my opinion, whether we like it or not, we may not like it, but this is the...
In your learned opinion, is there one of the two countries that has a better claim on the area than the other?
From a legal perspective,
I suppose.
whether one of the countries has a better legal claim to the area.
Well, it's important to recognize the fact that in the Eastern Mediterranean, you have three countries that are not signees to the United Nations Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. That includes Israel, Turkey, and Syria, right? So from an Israeli perspective, and this is part of the reason why Israel is reluctant to use the United Nations as the primary mediator, Israel does not want to use that legal system in order to determine its maritime borders. It wants to negotiate individually with each of its neighbors. So in that sense, right, if I was to answer your question, it really depends on the framework, which legal framework you want to be using. The United Nations would give you one answer, the Lebanese would give you a second answer, more closer to the United Nations position, and Israel would give you a third answer. So it depends on the perspective. The United States, just to add to that, is also not a signee of the United Nations Law of the Sea, right? So that is also part of understanding the legal framework upon which all the parties are their starting points for understanding how do you even engage in that negotiation process.
And why can't they divide the area? Why can't they agree? What is the sticking point?
This is...
What is the sticking point?
Yeah.
Does each of the negotiating countries want the whole of the area and doesn't want to give up anything?
No, this is an excellent question. Basically, the answer to that, why, what's the sticking point is because this is Israel-Lebanon. This is the non-formal, the informal compromise offered by the Americans a few years ago was, as Gabriel said, 55-45, 55 for the Lebanese. Okay, let's try to negotiate both of us, and I will raise it to 60-40. Can we reach? Basically, it should be seen from this point of view, in my opinion, from practical point of view. It benefits both sides to go ahead. So there is no, Otherwise, we may negotiate based on this legal aspect or that legal aspect for years.
And an important thing, just to add to that, is that generally, when two states come to an agreement to demarcate their maritime borders, many states have a unitization agreement attached to it, which means that a unitization agreement is essentially, if something is found, and it's a certain percentage on your side of the line and a certain percentage of my side of the line, that we will share the revenue, based on those percentages. Israel has one with Cyprus, right? And actually, Israel's unitization agreement with Cyprus could be amended based on whatever kind of agreements are made in the future between Israel and Lebanon, right? But the bottom line is that it's not necessarily as simple as drawing a line. There are also future complications or questions that I assume would need to be asked by the people responsible for negotiations, so long as they are the right professional people asking these questions of, if something is found, are we sharing? Does the word share go along in the same sentence with Israel and Lebanon, right? So I think that in part the reason why negotiations have stalled, as Mickey said, is that it's Israel-Lebanon. So it's never as simple as, let's just reach the terms of the deal. There's the historical narratives and the egos involved on both sides. But in addition to that, it's actually a complicated legal process, which, once again, we're in the negotiations prior to the negotiations, right? So even if things fall apart or manage to succeed and we reach a point in which Israeli and Lebanese officials are sitting at the same table, there's no guarantee for success once they're at the same table.
Again, emphasizing the political context for countries to fulfill their economic interests. Even when they have the motivation, the lack of political relations diminishes the chances of that happening. Yes,
You said that the Americans have the best position to be mediator. Economically speaking, for the states, gas in this region is a minor issue, I would believe. But for Europe, it's a quite important question, because it can be built a kind of supply chain which is south to the one they have with the Russian, and it's a good alternative to the Russian pressure. So there is an economic interest maybe in the European countries, not only Greece and Cyprus. It could be a kind of leverage, economic leverage, to have the Lebanese and Israel to work together. And one question which is not into this question, does Lebanon have an agreement with Cyprus about their delimitation, and if there has a consequence to the deal between Israel and Lebanon? Two questions, sorry.
You were the ambassador to Cyprus, so you should take that second question first.
I would take both of them, it's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
You're right, of course, yes. The EU, Europe should be, let's say, theoretically or practically, yes, but it doesn't somehow. Why?
Can help them.
Please?
By saying only the American,
Please,
you say
no.
to the European.
No, what I'm saying is that the fact, July 2019, that nobody speaks about a European role in this mediation. Now, I'm not against any other mediation, of course not. What I'm saying is that if I need to emphasize the most practical way to go ahead, it seems to me that this is the right. But you are absolutely right, of course. The fact is never, correct me if I'm wrong, never in the last, let's say, 10 years, there was a real effort for you of Europe to lead these, let's say, dispute between, solving this dispute between Israel and Lebanon. And yes, there is an agreement between Cyprus and Lebanon, which was signed, if I'm not mistaken, 2007, of, let's say, the exclusive economic, the maritime border between Cyprus and Lebanon, yes. There is an agreement.
Yeah, if I was to just add, one, but it might actually end up being a very temporary one. As I mentioned, the European Union is conducting a feasibility test of a proposed East Med pipeline. I happen to be in the camp of the skeptical camp about both the commercial and the technical feasibility of an undersea pipeline, which would be the longest in the world. But we could have a situation which a year from now, or even in less time, the European Union says, we support all efforts of the parties in the region to, cooperate with one another, but we're not going to be the buyers, right? The European Union is a big fan of diversification of supply, and certainly if they could actualize this pipeline or any form of regional cooperation in the region, I think the European Union will support it, certainly between Israel and Lebanon. But odds are, if we're projecting 5-10 years from now, the #1 supplier of natural gas to the European Union will be the United States. With LNG.
It's a longer.
It's a longer route, and it may come with its own carrots and sticks involved. But at least long-term projections, that seems to be what may end up taking place. I think the EU will try to support whatever it can, but it boils down to commercial and technical feasibility, and we just don't know. That's yet to be determined.
We'll take one more question.
Out of all of the reasons you presented why negotiations might not take place, what do you think is the most relevant? What might really make negotiations not take place? And how can those concerns be addressed?
Could you just repeat I missed the first half of the
So
question.
you presented some reasons why negotiations might not take place. Out of all of those reasons, what do you think is the most relevant? What is the most important, and how can we address some of those concerns or get past them?
I suppose the main obstacles are domestic politics in Lebanon. Domestic politics in Lebanon. How to maintain the agreement by all parties in Lebanon, or the initial agreement, let's say, to resume talks, and how to keep it. It seems that it is quite clear it's going to be, let's say, a very challenging job. How to address it, I suppose, if David Satterfield is still to be the key player, so he should work very hard, even if he's going to be the next ambassador to Ankara, in order to resume, let's say, talks based on what has been achieved in the recent few weeks.
Yeah, I would say that the biggest threat is timing, right?
Yeah.
For negotiations to be successful, you need the timing to work out for all of the parties. So, this isn't a particularly important issue for Israelis, but it could be if negotiations were even to be marginally successful, and I mean marginally successful, then returning to agreeing to arrive at the negotiating table. But the timing is important. As Mickey mentioned, if David Satterfield gets replaced, then it creates a window of maybe 3 or possibly as long as 6 months in which other developments could, essentially carry the emphasis away from reaching an agreement between these two countries and to other more important issues. And certainly, this is not perhaps the most pressing maritime issue in the Eastern Mediterranean. Right now, Cyprus and Turkey have their own dispute over where their maritime borders are, which is, I would argue, also distracting or drawing more European attention, much more European attention. And this is a very different situation because it involves a EU member and also a member of NATO. So it's quite possible that kind of the timing issue could end up kind of delaying things by years. The last significant process was 7 years ago, right? So, if things get sidetracked, it could be another 7 years before the parties decide to negotiate, consider this again. Yeah.
And they are also in transition in terms of Israeli government to take some time, and also with the European institution. So the next commission, they also have some different priorities.
So in a way, I suppose this is the best time when there is no official government.
But while it's important to note that we are actually talking about negotiations that haven't begun. Usually in Israel-Arab relations, when there are breakthroughs towards negotiation, it's not something that has so many media headlines before. It's something that just happens, and then we know about it. Here we've been talking about it for months and for weeks, leaks from here, from there, and that's a very unique component for that talk, which I'm not sure is constructive in the process. But overall, summing the discussion, the fact that we are talking on Israel and Lebanon in the context of negotiation and diplomacy and not in the context of rockets and war, is a good development, a good opportunity that we should try and make the most of. And thank you, Mickey and Gabi, and thank you all for being up here, and thank you to JTC for